Sophie had always known what it was like to be invisible. Not in the way it's portrayed in movies where a person is secretly watched without being noticed. No, Sophie was invisible because her presence wasn't wanted. She was too big for her age, with fat accumulating on her body in a way that felt like a second skin heavy and uncomfortable. It wasn't just about her size, but the emotional weight of being the child no one wanted. At 10 years old, Sophie felt like a shadow. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just an image of a girl who didn't fit the beauty standards. It was a cruel reminder that she didn't belong anywhere. She was never picked for games at school, never had friends who would stand up for her. The other kids her age avoided her, and the adults, when they remembered her, were always kind, but with a kindness that seemed more like pity. She'd grow up and become a beautiful woman one day, they'd say, as if it were some kind of consolation. But Sophie knew that wouldn't happen. She had gone to the orphanage when she was only 4 years old. Her biological parents, who could never handle her needs, had left her there, without explanation, without tears. Sophie grew up between cold walls and other boys and girls who, like her, had no one to call home. But unlike them, Sophie believed that loneliness was her ultimate fate. She was too big, too slow, and too different to be loved. Attempts to adopt Sophie failed time and time again. 1, 2, 3 couples came and looked, but no one took her home. They'd look at her appearance and walk away, leaving Sophie behind, sitting in her corner, eyes fixed on the floor. She had never been good enough. Until, at 10 years old, she was introduced to Hugo and Luca. When they arrived at the orphanage, Sophie was in her usual spot. Most of the children had gathered for the visit from the prospective adoptive parents, but she knew she wouldn't have any luck. So she sat alone, watching the raindrops trickle down the window, thinking about what was to come. The footsteps of Hugo and Luca echoed down the hallway, and the sound was enough to make her heart race, but she didn't have the courage to look. She didn't want to be disappointed again. "Are you Sophie?" Hugo asked, with a soft but firm voice that made Sophie finally raise her head. Luca smiled at her, a smile that wasn't filled with pity, but with understanding, as if they knew exactly who she was. Sophie didn't know what to think. Those 2 men, so different from everyone else who had come through, didn't seem scared or bothered by her size. In fact, it seemed like they were seeing her in a way she had never imagined, filled with hope. "Do you want to come home with us?" Luca asked, his eyes filled with sincere empathy. It was the first time Sophie had ever heard a question like that, and without thinking, she just nodded. Something inside her, something she had never allowed herself to feel, lit up. The idea of having a home, of finally being chosen. In the days that followed, Sophie was welcomed into the home of Hugo and Luca. The 2 of them were different from anything she had ever known. They didn't rush to change who she was, but they knew they could help her. Not with magic tricks or empty promises, but with patience, discipline, and most of all, love. They taught her about healthy habits, not in a punitive way, but with kindness. Hugo, who was a nutritionist, prepared balanced meals, and Luca, who was a physical educator, encouraged her to move in a playful way without pressure. Sophie, for the first time, began to realize that the problem wasn't her body, but the way she viewed it. And over time, she started to look at herself differently, with care. Little by little, the changes started. Sophie didn't lose weight overnight, but her self-esteem began to bloom. She began to understand that it wasn't her body that made her special, but her ability to overcome difficulties. With Hugo and Luca's constant support, she found the confidence to face adversities, to fight against judgmental stares, and above all, to embrace who she truly was. But the real change wasn't just in Sophie's body. It was in her mind, the way she saw herself and the world around her. Sophie didn't know that this early part of her life, with all its challenges and limitations, had only been the beginning of a much larger story. The story of a young woman who would learn that true beauty comes from within, and that her real strength wasn't in changing to please others, but in being herself, without fear, without shame, and with self-love. The journey was just beginning. As Sophie settled into life with Hugo and Luca, the first few weeks were filled with a whirlwind of new experiences. There was the smell of home-cooked meals in the air, the sound of soft music playing in the background, and the peaceful evenings spent in their cozy living room. Sophie had never felt so safe. For the first time, she could truly relax and not worry about the weight of rejection hanging over her. But comfort was not the same as change, and Sophie, despite the kindness and patience that surrounded her, was still plagued by her old insecurities. She couldn't escape the whispers in her mind, the thoughts telling her that she wasn't good enough. She didn't feel pretty. She didn't feel worthy of the love Hugo and Luca were giving her, but they were determined to show her otherwise. One afternoon, Luca took her to the park, promising they would have fun. Sophie didn't know what to expect. She had never been one for exercise, and the idea of running around in front of strangers filled her with dread. But Luca was insistent. "You don't have to run, Sophie. You can walk, jog, or even just enjoy the view. Let's start slow, okay?" Sophie hesitated, but the look in Luca's eyes told her that he wasn't asking for perfection. It was a strange feeling to have someone expect her to take things one step at a time instead of pushing her to be something she wasn't yet. So she agreed. They spent the afternoon walking around the park, and Sophie started to notice something she hadn't before, the beauty around her, the way the trees swayed in the wind, the laughter of children playing, the warmth of the sun on her face. For the first time in a long while, Sophie felt like she wasn't invisible. She was just another person enjoying a sunny day, free from the weight of judgment. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Sophie's body didn't change overnight, and with each passing week, she faced both physical and emotional setbacks. There were days when the weight of her insecurities returned, creeping up on her and making her feel as if she would never be enough. Sometimes she would sit in her room and cry, frustrated with the slow progress and the constant reminder of her past. Hugo and Luca, though, were always there, offering comfort and encouragement. "It's okay to have bad days, Sophie," Hugo would say as he sat beside her. "What matters is that you don't give up. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to keep going." And Sophie did keep going, even when the road felt impossibly long. She learned to appreciate the little victories, like choosing a healthy snack over her usual comfort food, or completing a walk without feeling completely exhausted. It was in these small moments that she began to understand the value of consistency and patience. No matter how many setbacks she faced, she knew she was moving forward. As the months passed, Sophie's body started to change, but it was her mindset that truly transformed. She began to see the beauty in her own strength, the way her body could carry her through challenges, how it responded to care and attention. She wasn't just shedding pounds. She was shedding the layers of self-doubt that had clouded her for so long. There was still a long way to go, but Sophie no longer felt like she was on this journey alone. With every step, Hugo and Luca were right beside her, cheering her on, reminding her of her worth. They never pushed her too hard. They only offered the support and love she needed to make changes at her own pace. One day, while at the grocery store with Hugo, Sophie caught sight of herself in the reflection of the glass door. She paused, not recognizing the person staring back at her. It wasn't just her body that had changed, it was her face. There was a light in her eyes now, a confidence that hadn't been there before. She smiled at her reflection, feeling something new inside her, pride. It was a small step, but it was one she would never forget. It was the moment Sophie realized that the journey was no longer just about losing weight. It was about finding herself. The years passed, and Sophie's life slowly began to transform in ways she never imagined. At 15, she had developed not only a new body, but a new way of seeing herself. She had become someone who no longer hid in the shadows, but stood proudly in the light. Her self-esteem was stronger than ever before, and her relationships with Hugo and Luca had deepened. They had taught her that love wasn't about changing who you were, but embracing who you could become. At school, Sophie was still a bit of an outsider, but she no longer let the whispers of classmates bother her. She had learned to tune out the negativity, focusing instead on her studies and her passions. One of her favorite activities was painting. With her brushes in hand, Sophie could forget about everything else and create a world of color that was all her own. But even with her newfound confidence, there were still days when she struggled. The world had a way of reminding her that she was different. There were the looks from other girls who wore clothes that she couldn't quite fit into, the taunts from the popular crowd who whispered about her behind her back. And even though she had come so far, Sophie still found herself wondering if she would ever truly fit in. It was during one of these moments of doubt that Hugo sat down with her after dinner, as he always did when he sensed she was troubled. "Sophie, I know things aren't always easy," he said, his voice soft but firm, "but I need you to understand something. You are not defined by the opinions of others. You are defined by the choices you make for yourself. You can choose to see yourself as you are, or you can choose to see yourself as you could be. And I think you already know which choice is the right one." Sophie looked at him, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. Hugo's words were always so simple, but they always seemed to cut right to the heart of her fears. She had never felt so deeply understood. Over the next few years, Sophie continued to grow, both inside and out. At 18, she decided to take a bold step. Inspired by the confidence she had gained from her journey, Sophie entered her first beauty pageant. It was something she had never imagined herself doing before, but there was a part of her that felt ready for the challenge. The day of the pageant, Sophie stood backstage, nerves twisting in her stomach. She could hear the other contestants laughing and chatting, but Sophie remained quiet, staring into the mirror. The face that looked back at her was different from the girl who had first entered Hugo and Luca's home. It was the face of someone who had fought through pain and doubt and come out stronger on the other side. When her name was finally called, Sophie walked onto the stage. her heart pounding in her chest. She felt all eyes on her, and for a brief moment she wondered if she had made a mistake. But then she remembered Hugo's words. She wasn't here to prove anything to anyone else. She was here to prove something to herself. Sophie smiled as she stood tall, the spotlight casting a warm glow over her. The audience's gaze no longer made her feel small. For the first time she felt like she belonged, like she was enough just as she was. The pageant was an experience that opened her eyes in ways she hadn't expected. Although she didn't win, the journey itself was a victory. She had overcome her fear of being judged, of not being good enough. She had stood before a crowd and shown them her true self. And in that moment, Sophie realized something important. Winning wasn't about the title. It was about conquering the inner battle she had fought for so long. But it was only the beginning. Sophie's confidence continued to grow, and after a few more pageants, she decided to go for one more, the national competition. This time there was no fear. She had already won in so many ways. It was the day of the national pageant when Sophie found herself backstage again. But this time she was calm. She knew she was different, not just in the way she looked, but in the way she saw herself. She wasn't just a contestant. She was a young woman who had faced her demons and triumphed. The competition was fierce, with some of the most talented and beautiful women in the country. But as the final moments of the contest approached, Sophie's mind was clear. She didn't need to be the best in the room. She didn't need to compare herself to anyone else. She just needed to be herself. As the judges called out the winner, Sophie's heart raced, but she felt peaceful. When they announced her name, it was almost surreal. Sophie, the girl who had once been invisible, was now standing at the top of the pageant world. The crowd erupted in applause, but Sophie could barely hear them. All she could hear was the voice of Hugo, who had always believed in her, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." For Sophie, the title was more than just a crown. It was a culmination of everything she had worked for. It was proof that the journey to self-love, discipline, and perseverance had paid off. She had won, not because of her appearance, but because of the person she had become. As Sophie stood on the stage, holding the crown, she knew that this was only the beginning. She wasn't done yet. There was still so much more for her to accomplish, but she had already proven to herself that she was capable of achieving anything. And with Hugo and Luca by her side, she knew that there was no limit to what she could achieve. After her triumph in the national pageant, Sophie's life changed dramatically. She was no longer the shy, introverted girl who once hid from the world. Instead, she was celebrated, admired by many, and even invited to speak at events about body positivity and self-love. But with this new attention came a new set of pressures. Sophie was no longer just an ordinary young woman. She was now a symbol of transformation, a beacon for others who struggled with their own insecurities. While the praise was flattering, Sophie couldn't help but feel a weight on her shoulders. She had spent so many years fighting against the opinions of others, but now it felt like the world had decided who she was and what she should represent. It was as if her success had become a template for others, and the expectations placed on her were suffocating. Hugo and Luca, ever supportive, could sense the shift in Sophie's demeanor. They had always been her foundation, the constant presence in her life that grounded her. But now Sophie seemed distant at times, lost in her own thoughts. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Hugo spoke up, his voice gentle but firm. "Sophie," he began, "we're proud of you, of everything you've accomplished, but I can tell something's bothering you. You've always been someone who marched to the beat of her own drum, but now I see you struggling to live up to someone else's idea of who you are." Sophie lowered her fork, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and frustration. "It's just, I don't know if I can keep up with everyone's expectations. I want to inspire people, but sometimes it feels like I'm just a project to them, not a real person." Luca reached across the table and placed his hand on Sophie's. "You are real, Sophie. More real than anyone we know. But you don't have to be perfect for anyone. The only expectation you need to meet is your own." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she listened to their words. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. She didn't have to be everything to everyone. She could just be herself, flaws, imperfections, and all. The next few weeks were a time of reflection for Sophie. She withdrew from some of the spotlight, taking a step back to recalibrate. She focused on her passions, her art, and her relationships, and she realized that her true worth wasn't determined by the accolades she received, but by how she felt about herself when no one was watching. But as much as she tried to distance herself from the expectations, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She had worked so hard to transform her body and her mind, but there was still a part of her that longed for validation. She wanted to prove that she was more than just her appearance, that she was capable of achieving even greater things. It was during this period of self-reflection that Sophie received an invitation to participate in a charity event, an opportunity to use her platform for something bigger than herself. The event was a gala to raise funds for children in need, and Sophie was asked to speak about her journey and how she had overcome the obstacles she had faced. She hesitated at first, unsure if she was ready to open up again. But then she realized that this was the chance she had been waiting for. This was an opportunity to be more than just the girl who had won a beauty pageant. She could be someone who made a difference. The night of the event, Sophie arrived at the venue with Hugo and Luca by her side. She wore a simple yet elegant dress, a stark contrast to the glamorous gown she had worn for the pageants. She felt a sense of peace as she walked through the crowd, realizing that this was where she truly belonged, not in the spotlight for her appearance, but in the spotlight for her heart. When it was her turn to speak, Sophie stood before the audience, the microphone in her hand, and she felt a sense of calm settle over her. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She was there to share her story, to remind people that beauty was more than skin deep. "I've spent a lot of my life trying to fit into a mold," Sophie began, her voice steady. "I've spent so many years trying to meet other people's expectations of who I should be, what I should look like, and how I should act. But along the way, I've learned something important. I am enough, just as I am. And so are all of you. No matter what the world says, we are all worthy of love, of respect, and of the space to be who we are." The room was silent as Sophie spoke, her words resonating deeply with everyone present. For the first time, Sophie felt like she had found her true purpose, not to be a symbol of transformation for others, but to be a voice for those who needed to hear that they, too, were enough. That night, Sophie didn't walk away with any awards or recognition, but she did walk away with something far more valuable. the knowledge that she had finally embraced who she truly was without apology. As she left the event, Hugo placed his arm around her shoulders. "You were amazing," he said, his voice filled with pride. Sophie smiled, feeling a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in a long time. "I was just being myself," she replied. And in that moment, she knew that being herself was all she ever needed to be. As Sophie settled into this newfound understanding of herself, the outside world began to take on a different perspective. She wasn't just a girl who had won a beauty pageant or who had lost weight and transformed herself physically. She had become a symbol, a representation of the ideal that others longed to achieve. And while Sophie appreciated the support, she couldn't shake the feeling that her transformation was being used as a form of validation for others' struggles. She began to realize how much pressure had been placed on her without her consent. People saw her as an example of hard work and discipline, of how a girl could change her entire life by simply changing her appearance. But Sophie knew that her transformation had been more than just losing weight or becoming beautiful. It had been a deep, emotional, and mental journey, one that required vulnerability, growth, and sometimes a great deal of pain. The pressure to remain perfect began to chip away at Sophie's peace. The public perception of her was now tied to how she looked and how well she could maintain this image of success. It was no longer about the journey, but about the results. Sophie was no longer just Sophie. She was the before and after. People began to question her every move. Did she still work out as much as before? Did she eat healthy every single day? Were her accomplishments truly her own, or had they been engineered by the people around her? Everywhere she went, Sophie was scrutinized. There were people who congratulated her on how far she'd come, but there were also whispers in corners. "She looks so good now, but how long will it last?" they would say, or "she must be on a strict diet to maintain that figure." These thoughts seeped into Sophie's mind, eroding her confidence. For the first time in a long while, she felt insecure again. The battle had never been just about weight or beauty. It was always about learning to accept who she was, flaws and all, but the world wasn't making it easy for her. Hugo and Luca could see the change in her. They knew something was off, and they worried that Sophie might be slipping back into the self-doubt she had worked so hard to overcome. They had always been there to support her, but now they could sense that Sophie needed more than just encouragement. She needed time to rediscover herself outside of the expectations of others. "Sophie, I can see something's wrong," Luca said one evening as they sat together in the living room. "You've been quiet for days. You've been pushing yourself so hard, and I think you're starting to forget who you really are." Sophie sighed, looking down at her hands. "I don't know how to handle it anymore. People are always watching me, always judging. I feel like I'm being turned into something I'm not. And I'm scared that if I don't keep up, I'll lose everything." Hugo joined in, placing his hand gently on Sophie's shoulder. "Sophie, nothing can take away everything you've worked for. You've fought hard for the person you've become. But the world's opinions don't define you. The only opinion that matters is yours." It was then that Sophie realized something. She had been so focused on the external validation that she had forgotten the internal work that had made her strong. She had always been more than her appearance, more than the number on the scale or the label people placed on her. Her true strength lay in the resilience she had cultivated over the years, in her ability to love herself despite the challenges. But Sophie was still struggling to reconcile the image that others had of her and the person she truly was. She wasn't just the transformed version of herself. She was a complex individual with fears, dreams, and desires. And those parts of her needed to be acknowledged and celebrated too. Sophie took a step back. She spent time alone, reflecting on everything she had been through. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always clear, but she slowly began to untangle the web of expectations that had been woven around her. She learned to appreciate her flaws, to accept that she wasn't perfect, and that was okay. No one was, and that was the beauty of being human. It took months for Sophie to fully reconcile these two versions of herself, the woman the world saw and the woman she knew herself to be. She started focusing on what made her truly happy, creating art, volunteering at local charities, and simply spending time with the people she loved. One day, Sophie decided to take a bold step. She walked away from the beauty pageant circuit for a while. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the opportunities it had given her, but she realized that she had to take care of herself, first her mental and emotional health. She wanted to find herself again without the constant pressure of the industry watching her every move. It wasn't an easy decision, and there were moments of doubt. But Sophie knew that this time she wasn't running away from success. She was running towards something deeper, a place where she could just be herself, without the expectations of others looming over her. Hugo and Luca supported her completely. "You're always going to be our star," Luca said, his voice filled with pride. "But we want you to shine in the way that makes you happy, not because the world tells you to." Sophie smiled, feeling an immense sense of peace. "Thank you. I think I'm finally figuring out what that means." The world outside would continue to judge her, to watch her journey with eager eyes. But Sophie was no longer concerned with fitting into someone else's mold. She had become her own person, and that was enough. Sophie's decision to step back from the beauty circuit wasn't understood by everyone. Some of her fans expressed their confusion, wondering why someone who had worked so hard to achieve success would suddenly walk away from it. The media buzzed with questions. Had she lost her drive? Was she succumbing to the pressure? But Sophie didn't care about their questions anymore. She had learned something far more important than how to look good on a stage. She had learned how to live for herself, and not for the approval of others. In the months that followed, Sophie found herself in a strange new world. The pressure she had once felt to look a certain way, to fit into a mold, had dissipated. She was free to focus on the things that truly mattered to her, creating art, helping others, and embracing her full, authentic self. Yet as she immersed herself in her new life, she couldn't help but feel a pull towards something else. Sophie had always loved helping people. It was one of the things that had kept her grounded throughout her journey. She had started volunteering at shelters, offering support to women who had faced struggles similar to her own. She had learned that beauty was far more than skin deep. It wasn't about being the thinnest, the most conventionally attractive, or the one who fit into society's narrow standards. True beauty, Sophie now understood, came from the heart, the kindness we show, the compassion we extend, and the courage we have to be ourselves. Her time at the shelter opened Sophie's eyes to the depth of human struggle and resilience. She found herself speaking to women who, like her, had been broken down by society's standards of beauty. They had been told they weren't enough, that they needed to change in order to be loved and accepted. And Sophie shared her story with them, how she had once believed that her worth was tied to her appearance, how she had struggled with self-esteem, but how she had learned to embrace herself. There were tears, laughter, and long conversations, and Sophie realized that her story wasn't just her own. It was a story shared by many, and so with every woman she helped, Sophie found herself growing even more, learning that her purpose wasn't just about changing her life, it was about changing the lives of others too. It wasn't long before Sophie began to take on a more prominent role in the shelter. She became a mentor, a figure of hope for women who had lost their way, helping them rebuild their confidence. She taught them about self-love, not in the superficial sense of loving one's reflection in a mirror, but in the sense of honoring oneself, body, and soul. She talked about the importance of developing a healthy mindset, one that didn't depend on validation from others, but on inner strength and self-respect. But as much as Sophie had grown, there was still a piece of her that felt incomplete. She had overcome so many of the obstacles that had once held her back, but one lingering question remained. Was she truly happy with the person she had become? Was the life she had built for herself enough? The doubt gnawed at her. She had conquered the physical aspect of her transformation, but she hadn't fully healed from the emotional scars that came with her past. She had spent years fighting to prove to herself and to others that she was worthy of love and success. But what if she was still running from something? What if deep down she hadn't fully forgiven herself for the years of self-doubt? Sophie decided to confront that feeling head-on. She returned to the town where she had grown up, the place where she had first been abandoned by her birth parents. Walking through the familiar streets stirred up memories, some painful, some filled with longing. She stood in front of the orphanage where she had spent her childhood, the place where she had first learned the meaning of loneliness. It was there, in the quiet of the empty building, that Sophie found the closure she had been searching for. She stood in front of a mirror and looked at her reflection. She didn't see the winner of a beauty pageant or the woman who had once been insecure and unsure. Instead, she saw a woman who had fought for everything she had, someone who had built herself from the ground up. And in that moment, Sophie realized something profound. She didn't need to change for anyone. She was enough just as she was. Her journey wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. It was about embracing who she was, scars and all. And Sophie understood that now. She had nothing left to prove. Returning to her life in the city, Sophie resumed her work at the shelter, but this time with a renewed sense of purpose. She had found her true calling, not in the glitter of a beauty contest, but in the quiet, everyday acts of kindness that made a real difference in people's lives. Sophie's story spread, but it wasn't just about the weight she had lost or the beauty she had gained. It was about her journey of healing, self-discovery, and compassion. It was about her realization that in the end, the most beautiful thing about her wasn't her appearance, but the love and care she gave to others. Her life was richer now, not because of the applause she once sought, but because of the lives she touched along the way. Sophie had become a woman who understood the true meaning of beauty, and she had embraced it in all its forms. Months passed since Sophie's realization that her worth was no longer tied to the superficial. She continued her work at the shelter, growing in ways she never imagined. The more she helped others find their self-worth, the more she uncovered pieces of herself. But there was still something missing. As Sophie dedicated her life to helping those who had been rejected, abused, or marginalized, she began to wonder if she was truly living a life that felt complete. She had love, purpose, and success in her work, but what about her personal life? It wasn't that she was lonely. Sophie had developed deep and meaningful relationships with the women she helped, but a part of her longed for something different. She wondered if she would ever experience romantic love or if her life would always revolve around healing others. The question lingered in her mind, but she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the lives she was touching. The work she did at the shelter felt fulfilling, yet something deep inside her craved connection beyond the professional sphere. One late afternoon, as she sat in the shelter's common room, Sophie received an unexpected visitor. A man in his 30s walked through the door with a nervous yet hopeful look in his eyes. His name was Adam, and he had heard of Sophie's journey through a mutual friend. He had come to see her, not for advice, but to share his own story of struggle and transformation. Adam was a former client of the shelter, someone who had faced many of the same challenges Sophie had in her youth. He had battled addiction, self-loathing, and isolation, but with time, he had turned his life around. Now he was committed to helping others who were still stuck in the darkness of their struggles. And as fate would have it, he had found himself standing before Sophie, the woman whose story had inspired him to keep fighting for himself. The two spoke for hours. Adam shared his past with Sophie, detailing the years of pain and the long journey toward healing. Sophie, in turn, opened up about her experiences about the weight of expectations, the struggles she had overcome, and the lessons she had learned. It was a connection unlike any she had experienced before. It wasn't built on pity, admiration, or superficial attraction. It was built on understanding, shared experiences, and mutual respect. As the conversation continued, Sophie found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. A deep, authentic connection with someone who truly understood her. Adam's words resonated with her, and in his presence, Sophie felt seen, not as a charity case or a symbol of transformation, but as Sophie, the woman who had lived through heartache, triumph, and everything in between. Over the next few weeks, Sophie and Adam's friendship grew. They met regularly to talk, share stories, and discuss their work at the shelter. They worked together on various initiatives to help others, and their bond only deepened with time. Sophie was surprised by how natural and easy their connection felt, and with each passing day, she realized that she was developing feelings for Adam. One evening, as the two of them sat on a bench outside the shelter, Adam turned to Sophie, his eyes serious but filled with warmth. "Sophie," he said, his voice steady, "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything you've done for others. You've built a life of purpose, but I wonder, do you ever think about building a life together with someone?" Sophie's heart raced as she looked at him. His words took her by surprise, but as she reflected on their time together, she realized she had been thinking the same thing. The loneliness she had once felt seemed to fade away in his presence. Sophie had never imagined that she would find someone who truly understood her struggles and celebrated her triumphs. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think about it all the time. I never expected this, but I think I'm ready for something more." From that moment on, Sophie and Adam's relationship blossomed. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, nor was it without its challenges. They were both committed to their work and passionate about helping others, but they made time for each other, building a foundation of trust, communication, and support. Sophie realized that love wasn't just about finding someone to fill a void, it was about growing together, learning together, and being there for each other through life's ups and downs. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was grounded in the understanding that both of them had experienced profound pain and transformation. They were two souls who had been shaped by their pasts, yet found comfort and strength in the present they were building together. And as Sophie continued to work at the shelter and inspire others with her story, she began to realize something else. Her life wasn't just about healing herself or helping others. It was about the connections she formed along the way. The people she met, Adam, her parents, the women at the shelter, had all been a part of her journey. Each one had played a role in helping her understand that beauty was not just something we see in the mirror, but something we share through our actions, our love, and our ability to connect with others on a deep, meaningful level. In the end, Sophie learned that true beauty wasn't about fitting into society's narrow standards or winning a pageant. It wasn't about the perfect body or the flawless face. It was about the strength to live authentically, to love without fear, and to build a life that was meaningful, not because of the accolades she received, but because of the people she touched along the way. Her journey wasn't over. There was still much to learn, much to experience, and much to give. But Sophie was no longer the girl who felt invisible. She was the woman who had found her place in the world, one that was filled with love, purpose, and the beauty of true connection. The days grew longer as Sophie and Adam's relationship continued to deepen. They became inseparable, not just as partners, but as teammates in the ongoing mission to help others. Together, they hosted workshops at the shelter, encouraging women to take pride in their bodies, to accept their flaws, and to understand the importance of mental health alongside physical health. Sophie's message, one she had lived for so long, had become a beacon of hope for so many others. Yet, for Sophie, this new chapter in her life felt unfamiliar. She had always prided herself on being independent, and the idea of relying on someone else, even Adam, was a concept she struggled to fully embrace. Though their connection was real and their love was genuine, there were moments when Sophie felt the overwhelming weight of her past creeping back into her thoughts. She had spent so much of her life alone, believing she wasn't worthy of love, and even now, she sometimes questioned if she was deserving of the relationship she had with Adam. Adam, however, was patient and understanding. He knew Sophie's history and the fears that came with it. He had seen the way she had healed herself, gradually transforming from the shy, introverted girl she once was to the confident, compassionate woman she had become. Yet he also saw that there were moments when Sophie still doubted herself, when she questioned whether someone could truly love her as she was, without trying to change her. He didn't want to rush her, but he wanted to show her that love in its truest form was built on trust and acceptance. One evening, after a long day of working at the shelter, Sophie sat on the porch of their small apartment, looking out at the city skyline. Adam joined her, sitting beside her and gently placing his hand over hers. The warmth of his touch comforted her, but there was still a lingering hesitation inside her. "Sophie," Adam began, his voice soft but filled with sincerity, "I know you're afraid of letting people get too close. I can see that sometimes you pull away when things get too real, too vulnerable. But I need you to understand something. I'm here for you. Not because I want to change you, but because I love who you are right now. All of you." Sophie's heart raced. She had heard those words before, but coming from Adam, they held a different weight. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, the steadiness in his touch. He wasn't asking her to be anyone else. He was simply offering his love, expecting nothing in return. "I don't know if I can believe that," Sophie whispered, the vulnerability in her voice betraying the walls she had built around herself. Adam gently lifted her chin, meeting her eyes with a steady gaze. "Believe in me, Sophie. Believe in us. And most of all, believe in yourself. You're stronger than you think." For the first time in a long while, Sophie allowed herself to let go of the doubt. She didn't have to be perfect to be loved. She just had to be herself. And in Adam's presence, Sophie felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She realized that love wasn't something that had to be earned. It was something that could be given freely, unconditionally. The next few months were transformative. Sophie and Adam's relationship continued to grow as they navigated life together, facing both challenges and triumphs side by side. The work at the shelter never stopped, and Sophie remained committed to helping those who needed it most. But now there was an added layer to her life, an openness to receive love, to trust in Adam, and to trust in herself. Sophie started to see herself in a new light. She wasn't just a girl who had overcome her insecurities. She was the woman who had learned to embrace her worth and to stand tall, no matter what the world thought. She realized that her journey wasn't about pleasing others or meeting societal expectations. It was about staying true to herself, about building a life that was grounded in authenticity and love. As the months turned into a year, Sophie began to consider her future in ways she never had before. She wasn't sure where life would take her, but for the first time she felt open to all the possibilities. She had Adam by her side. Her work at the shelter was thriving, and she was confident in her ability to face whatever challenges lay ahead. But as fate often does, life had other plans. One day, Sophie received an unexpected phone call. The beauty pageant she had once competed in years ago had reached out to her. They wanted her to return as a judge for the upcoming competition. The invitation stirred something deep inside her. Sophie hadn't thought about the pageant in years, and the idea of returning felt both strange and exciting. She wasn't sure what the role would entail, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about judging women on their appearance. It was about celebrating their journeys, their strengths, and the beauty that comes from living authentically. Sophie agreed to take on the role. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about giving back, sharing her story, and encouraging other women to see their own worth. And as she stepped into the arena once again, she felt a sense of empowerment that came from knowing she was no longer the girl who once doubted herself. She was the woman who had found her voice, her strength, and her place in the world. The years since Sophie had won the beauty pageant felt like a blur of accomplishments, personal growth, and a deepened sense of purpose. Her life with Adam continued to blossom, and together they became advocates for body positivity and mental health. using their platform to speak out for those who felt marginalized or overlooked. Sophie's past, once filled with insecurity and doubt, had transformed into a story of resilience and hope, one that she was proud to share with others. But just when Sophie thought her journey had come full circle, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, as she was preparing to speak at a women's empowerment conference in New York, she received a phone call that would alter her life once more. It was from the organizers of the same beauty pageant she had won all those years ago. "Sophie, we've been following your work," the voice on the other end of the line said. "We've seen how much you've grown, how you've become a role model to so many women. We'd like to invite you back, not as a contestant, but as the guest of honor. We want you to share your story on the main stage." Sophie was stunned. The invitation was flattering, but it also stirred something in her, something she hadn't quite expected. She had never imagined returning to the pageant world, especially after all the years she had spent distancing herself from the superficial aspects of beauty competitions. The very idea of being the guest of honor felt foreign to her. "I don't know," Sophie replied hesitantly. "I've built my life around empowering women to embrace their true selves, not to fit into some idealized mold. I'm not sure I want to be part of that world again." The woman on the phone was understanding. "We completely respect your feelings, Sophie. This isn't about the competition or the standard beauty ideals. We want to celebrate your transformation, your journey. We want to show the world that beauty isn't just about looks, it's about strength, resilience, and confidence." Sophie sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing on her. She had spent so long separating herself from the world that had once made her feel invisible and inadequate. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that her story wasn't just about what she had overcome, it was about what she was now able to give back. After some thought, Sophie made her decision. She agreed to speak at the event, but on one condition: she would speak honestly about the impact of pageants on self-esteem and the pressure to conform to societal standards. She would not sugarcoat the reality of what it meant to be a part of such a world, but she would also celebrate the evolution of beauty beyond superficial ideals. Adam, as always, supported her decision wholeheartedly. He admired her courage in confronting the very thing that had once made her feel small and inadequate. He knew that Sophie's true beauty had never been in her appearance. It had always been in her heart, her authenticity, and her willingness to use her voice to make a difference. The day of the event arrived, and Sophie stood backstage, her heart racing as she prepared to take the stage. The room was filled with the bright lights of cameras and the soft hum of excited chatter. For a moment, Sophie felt the familiar tug of self-doubt. She wasn't the same person she had been all those years ago. She had grown, changed, and become someone who was proud of her story, but she wasn't sure if the world was ready for the truth she was about to tell. As the crowd fell silent, Sophie stepped out onto the stage. The applause was deafening, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the warmth of the recognition. She wasn't just the winner of a pageant anymore. She was a woman who had transformed her life and was now using her platform to empower others. Taking a deep breath, Sophie began her speech. "When I first walked onto a stage like this, I thought I had to be something I wasn't. I thought that my worth was tied to how I looked, how I measured up to a standard of beauty that the world had created. But I've learned that beauty is not about the number on a scale. the color of your skin, or the size of your clothes. It's about who you are, how you treat others, and how you treat yourself. The crowd was silent, hanging on to every word. I've spent years learning to love myself, to accept my flaws, and to find strength in my vulnerability. And that journey for me was far more beautiful than any crown or title could ever be. Sophie's voice quivered with emotion as she continued. It's time for us to redefine beauty. It's time for us to see ourselves as worthy, as enough, just as we are. And I'm proud to stand here today not as someone who has conformed to society's standards, but as someone who has embraced their true self and, in doing so, found a beauty that's deeper and more meaningful than anything I could have ever imagined. The room erupted into applause. But for Sophie, it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the feeling of standing there, unapologetically herself, surrounded by a community of women who shared her belief in the power of self-love. That night, as Sophie and Adam returned to their apartment, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over her. She had taken a risk, stepping back into a world that had once made her feel small, but now she had used it as a platform to spread a message of hope and empowerment. Her journey, though far from over, had come full circle. She had faced her past, accepted it, and found a way to transform it into something beautiful. Sophie's story wasn't just about losing weight or winning a title. It was about rediscovering herself, about accepting her worth and embracing the love that was always there, waiting to be received. As Sophie looked out at the city skyline once again, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She wasn't the same girl who had once felt invisible. She was someone who had learned to see herself, truly see herself, for the first time. And that, she realized, was the most beautiful thing of all. Sophie's speech at the beauty pageant event had reverberated far beyond the walls of the convention hall. The message she shared about self-love, vulnerability, and the evolution of beauty went viral, reaching thousands of people from all walks of life. It sparked conversations everywhere, from social media platforms to coffee shops, from boardrooms to dinner tables. Women of all ages began to reflect on their own self-worth, reevaluating how they measured beauty. And many reached out to Sophie with messages of gratitude. For the first time in her life, Sophie truly felt like her voice mattered. She realized that her story, one of overcoming childhood insecurities, of being adopted by loving parents who taught her self-discipline, of facing her demons and embracing her own strength, had the power to inspire people far beyond what she had ever imagined. The aftermath of the pageant event gave Sophie a sense of purpose she had never anticipated. She was asked to speak at conferences, join panels, and write articles that explored the intersection of beauty, mental health, and body positivity. Sophie was now a recognized advocate, someone who had walked the walk and could talk the talk. It was strange to her at first. The girl who had once felt invisible was now in the spotlight, sharing her message with the world. Yet she couldn't deny the importance of it. She was using her platform not just for herself, but for those who had yet to find their own voice. Adam, as always, stood by her side, supporting her every step of the way. He admired her ability to balance her newfound public life with her commitment to maintaining the privacy and simplicity of their everyday life. They had long conversations about the impact they could have together. They spoke about building an organization for young girls, especially those who had been through experiences like Sophie's, to teach them the tools for self-love and resilience. Their shared vision became their mission. But not everything was easy. Along with the recognition came criticism. People who had once praised her were now questioning her motives, accusing her of abandoning her roots or trying to capitalize on her story. Sophie was no stranger to the cruelty of internet trolls, but the harshness still stung. She had worked so hard to break free from the narrative that beauty and self-worth were tied to appearance. But now people were questioning whether she was still playing the game by participating in the very system that had once made her feel inadequate. Sophie struggled with these doubts, especially when they came from voices she respected. Some of her childhood friends who had watched her grow privately expressed their concerns. They told her they feared she was becoming too attached to the world she had once distanced herself from. But Sophie had worked hard for this moment. She had earned her place, not by conforming, but by speaking her truth and using her experiences to empower others. One day, Sophie received a letter from someone who had followed her journey for years. The letter came from a woman named Emma, who had struggled with obesity her entire life. Emma shared her story with Sophie, how she had been bullied, ignored, and ostracized. She revealed how Sophie's story had given her the strength to finally seek help, to make the decision to change her life, and to reclaim her sense of self-worth. Emma thanked Sophie for being the light in her life when all seemed dark. Reading that letter, Sophie realized something profound. Her life was no longer just about herself. It was about the community of people she had unknowingly built, people who saw in her the reflection of their own struggles and dreams. They didn't need her to be perfect. They needed her to be real. This realization helped Sophie silence the doubts that had crept into her mind. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She had already proven everything she needed to when she took the stage and shared her truth. Sophie's life began to shift in other ways as well. She and Adam decided to take a step back from the constant media attention and focus on the foundation they were building. They poured their energy into creating workshops, outreach programs, and mentorship opportunities. The foundation quickly gained momentum, and Sophie found herself traveling across the country, meeting with young girls who had faced the same struggles she once had. She listened to their stories, offered words of encouragement, and shared her journey. She became the mentor she had once wished for, a guiding force for girls who didn't know their own worth yet. On one of these trips, Sophie returned to her hometown, a place she had avoided for years. The memories of her childhood, of the rejection, of being overlooked, had haunted her. She hadn't wanted to face the people who had once made her feel less than. But this time was different. Sophie had grown, she had healed, and now she was ready to confront the past with the confidence that only time and self-love could provide. Walking into her old neighborhood, Sophie was greeted by familiar faces. Her old schoolmates, many of whom had teased her and made her feel invisible, were now standing in front of her, asking for her forgiveness. They apologized for their actions and admitted that they, too, had learned valuable lessons from her journey. Sophie was taken aback by their humility. She didn't expect an apology, but it was a reminder of how far she had come. It was a powerful moment of healing, not just for her, but for the community as a whole. As Sophie left her childhood town, she felt a sense of closure. Her past no longer held power over her. She was free to move forward. and she was determined to use her experiences to continue spreading the message of self-worth, resilience, and the importance of love both for oneself and for others. Back in New York, as she and Adam sat in their favorite cafe, reflecting on their journey, Sophie's heart swelled with gratitude. She had become the woman she had always wanted to be, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. And in that moment, surrounded by the love and support of her chosen family, Sophie knew that her journey was just beginning. As Sophie continued to grow into her role as an advocate for self-love and body positivity, she began to reflect more deeply on the personal growth she had undergone. The success she had achieved in the beauty pageant and her subsequent work with the foundation had been monumental, but she realized that her journey wasn't just about external transformation. The real changes had taken place inside her. When Sophie first began her transformation, it was easy to focus on the outward changes, losing weight, refining her appearance, and becoming more physically active. Her parents, Hugo and Luca, had always emphasized the importance of discipline and structure. But as Sophie matured, she began to understand that the real challenge was in her mind. The self-doubt, the years of bullying, and the negative self-talk that had once defined her existence were harder to overcome than any physical challenge. The more she mentored young girls and shared her story, the more Sophie came to realize that beauty wasn't the goal. It was just a byproduct of something much deeper. Her transformation was about learning to see herself as worthy, despite all the messages she had received from society about what was considered acceptable. It was about accepting her imperfections, embracing her flaws, and not letting her past define her future. One evening, while on a rare visit to a quiet park near her apartment, Sophie had a conversation with Luca that would change her perspective forever. They sat on a bench beneath an old oak tree, the evening sun casting long shadows on the ground. "Sophie, do you ever miss the old you?" Luca asked gently, his voice filled with warmth. Sophie looked up at him, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "The Sophie before the fame, before the pageants. Do you miss her?" Sophie paused for a moment, considering the question. She had spent so much time working toward a different version of herself that she hadn't really thought about who she was before all of this. I guess I thought I would, but I don't. I've become someone who is proud who I am now. But I don't think the old me was something I needed to mourn. She was just part of the journey." Luca nodded. "I see. You've learned that who you were isn't who you have to be forever. And you've done the hard work of loving who you are now. It's not easy. Not everyone gets there." Sophie smiled. "I think I've always known that I was worth something. I just had to find the right people and the right moments to remind me. You and Hugo, you were those reminders." Luca laughed softly, brushing a lock of hair from his face. "You didn't need us to tell you that. We just helped you see it for yourself. You've always had the strength, Sophie." Their conversation lingered in the air, and Sophie felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time, she fully understood that her transformation wasn't a product of what others had done for her. It was something she had done for herself. The discipline, the commitment to self-care, the decision to challenge herself, it had all come from within. In the weeks that followed, Sophie began to refocus her efforts on the deeper work that was needed to continue helping others. She didn't just want to be a face that advocated for body positivity. She wanted to create lasting change that would impact the way people viewed themselves and the way society viewed others. Her goal was to redefine beauty standards, not just through appearance, but through how people valued each other, how they treated each other, and how they treated themselves. One of the first initiatives Sophie worked on was launching a mentorship program for young women who struggled with body image. She knew firsthand how easy it was to fall into the trap of comparing oneself to others and how damaging that could be. She wanted to create a space where girls could talk openly about their struggles, their fears, and their hopes without judgment. She reached out to a few of her closest friends, women she knew had struggled in their own ways, and together they created a series of workshops designed to help young women reclaim their sense of self-worth. The workshops were a hit. Sophie's presence in the room, her vulnerability, and her willingness to share her story made the girls feel safe. She talked about the challenges she had faced, not as a distant success story, but as someone who had walked through the same darkness they were facing. She taught them how to set goals for themselves, goals that weren't based on appearance, but on things that truly mattered: kindness, ambition, resilience. As Sophie watched the girls transform before her eyes, watching them slowly begin to embrace who they were, flaws and all, she was reminded of her own transformation. She understood that beauty, in its truest sense, was not something anyone could judge from the outside. It was something that came from within, something that couldn't be measured on a scale or by a dress size. Sophie's advocacy work continued to grow, and with it, her understanding of her own journey deepened. She became a sought-after speaker at conferences, not just for beauty pageants or self-help events, but in spaces where women gathered to talk about everything from mental health to business to family. Sophie wasn't just talking about body image anymore. She was talking about being a whole person, the kind of person who could set boundaries, who could forgive, who could accept, and who could love. Through it all, Sophie's relationship with Adam remained a constant source of support. They had grown together, both in their personal lives and in their professional pursuits. Adam, ever the steady rock, helped Sophie navigate the complexities of fame and responsibility. Together, they had become a force for change. And for Sophie, their partnership wasn't just about what they did together. It was about the way they made each other better. It was in the stillness of the night, in the quiet moments they shared over cups of tea, that Sophie realized something profound. Her journey was never really about the pageant or the applause. It was about the peace she had found within herself. It was about waking up every day and knowing that she was enough, exactly as she was. The road ahead wasn't always going to be easy, but Sophie was ready for whatever came next, because now, for the first time in her life, she knew that true beauty was never about perfection. It was about authenticity. It was about loving yourself enough to embrace every part of who you are, your past, your flaws, and your future. And as she stood there, looking out at the horizon, Sophie felt a deep, lasting peace. As Sophie approached her 30th birthday, she found herself standing at a crossroads. The years had flown by, and everything she had accomplished, every victory, every struggle seemed like a distant memory, now part of the larger mosaic of her life. Sophie had been to places she never thought she would go, and she had achieved things she never imagined possible. But now, standing in the quiet of her own thoughts, she wondered what more there was for her to do. What more could she contribute? Sophie had spent so much of her life proving herself to others. Now, she wanted to prove something to herself. She had reached a level of success she hadn't even known she could dream of, but she was no longer interested in chasing external validation. Her priorities had shifted. It was no longer about winning beauty pageants or being the face of campaigns. She was tired of that spotlight. Instead, she turned her focus inward once more, not just for her own healing, but for the future she wanted to create for the next generation of young women. Sophie had always said that beauty was a reflection of the heart, but now she truly understood what that meant. It wasn't just about how you looked, it was about the energy you gave off, the way you treated others, and the way you carried yourself in the world. After much thought, Sophie decided to open her own nonprofit organization, one dedicated to empowering young women not only to love themselves but also to take up space in the world unapologetically. She called it True Beauty, a name that was more than just a title. It was a movement. The goal was simple: to create a community where girls could support each other, share their struggles, and learn to celebrate their individual uniqueness. Her parents, Hugo and Luca, were her first supporters, helping her get the foundation off the ground. Sophie knew the road wouldn't be easy. She knew that there would be setbacks, challenges, and roadblocks, but she was ready for them. She had learned that nothing worth having came without effort. True Beauty took off faster than Sophie had expected. The demand for programs, workshops, and mentorship was overwhelming, and soon they expanded into multiple cities across the country. Sophie traveled to these cities, meeting with young girls and giving talks about self-love, acceptance, and resilience. She spoke at schools, at conferences, and at women's shelters. Everywhere she went, the message was the same: the world could be a better place if we all learned to accept ourselves and each other. Beauty was never a one-size-fits-all concept, and it was time to rewrite the narrative. In the midst of all of this, Sophie found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The struggle with her weight, the bullying, the years of doubting herself, it all seemed like it had happened to someone else. That girl was still a part of her, but Sophie had learned to let go of the parts of herself that no longer served her. She had built something far greater than a new appearance. She had built a new life, and now she was passing that gift along to others. Through the nonprofit, Sophie helped thousands of girls find their voice, teaching them that their value wasn't determined by what society told them was beautiful. They didn't need to change who they were to fit into someone else's mold. Sophie encouraged them to embrace their identities, their backgrounds, and their imperfections. The true beauty in each of them was something that no one could take away. As Sophie worked tirelessly, the media began to take notice again. But this time it wasn't about her appearance or the victories she had won. It was about the impact she was making. The world was starting to see her not just as a success story, but as a leader and advocate for change. Her journey from an insecure, overweight girl to a successful, confident woman was inspiring. But it was the work she was doing now that left a lasting legacy. There was one moment that stood out to Sophie above all others. She was hosting a retreat for young women who had graduated from her program, and she was standing on a stage in front of a group of smiling, empowered girls. As she looked out at the faces of the young women, who had transformed right before her eyes. Sophie realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for. This was the reason she had gone through everything she had gone through. Not for the applause or the recognition, but for this moment of connection, this moment where she could see that the seeds of change had been planted and were growing, flourishing into something much bigger than herself. Sophie's heart swelled with pride as she thought about everything she had accomplished. But more than that, she realized that her true success was not in the titles she had won or the public admiration she had gained. It was in the lives she had touched. It was in the girls who no longer felt invisible, who had learned to love themselves and pursue their dreams with no fear of judgment. Sophie's legacy was not just her personal journey. It was the ripple effect of the work she had done to help others find their strength. As she stood there, surrounded by young women, Sophie knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The world was changing, and Sophie was a part of that change. She had always been told that beauty was skin deep. But now she understood that beauty was infinite. It was the beauty of resilience, the beauty of transformation, and the beauty of kindness, and it would last far beyond the surface. Her story was not just about winning a beauty pageant. It was about winning at life by choosing to live authentically, to embrace challenges, and to empower others to do the same. Sophie had not only transformed herself, she had helped countless others do the same. And that, Sophie knew, was the greatest victory of all.